everyone, my name is Katrina Walser from Oliphant Cat and I am a knitting teacher and designer based in Sydney in Australia. And today I have a video for you about yarn weight. So a little while ago I asked what people would be interested in seeing videos about, and a couple of you asked for information about how to substitute yarn. If you are a newer knitter and you don't know what that actually means, all it is that when you start working with the pattern will have a yarn that's suggested by the designer for what to use to make that pattern. And there are all sorts of reasons why you wouldn't want to use that yarn. Sometimes it's just straight up not available where you are because it's a pattern you found from a different country. Sometimes it's not within your budget, or alternatively, it's a cheaper yarn and you want to use something a bit fancier. Or sometimes it can be, say, a different fibre that you're allergic to. So if the yarn is wool and you'd rather use cotton or acrylic, then you can substitute yarns in for that. There are lots of different considerations that you need to take into account when you substitute yarn, and it's because yarn has lots of different characteristics. But the main ones that I found that are important, and these are in decreasing order of importance, are the weight and the gauge that the yarn knits up to, the fibre type, and then what I'm calling constitution, which is the characteristics of the strands themselves. And so it's a pretty big topic, so I'm going to cover yarn weight in this video, and then we'll cover the other two topics later in later videos. So before we go on, I feel like I'd be a little bit remiss not to mention YARNSub. So YARNSub is a relatively new website that is a big database of lots and lots of different kinds of yarns, and you type in the name of the yarn that you want to substitute for, and it provides a lot of different alternatives based on how similar different yarns are across all of the characteristics that I just mentioned. It is a really handy tool, but I found that it's mostly biased towards American and UK yarns. And so even when I try and type in a yarn that I need, a lot of the suggestions show up as yarns that I still can't get here in Australia. So even if you are using YARNSub, it can still be handy to know how to do all of this yourself and just have an understanding of the different characteristics of yarn. And so I figured I would share everything that I know. Also, I do want to point out that I am mostly talking about this in a knitting context, but since we are talking about yarn, most of the info should be relevant for crocheters as well. So, what is yarn weight? In simplest term, it's the thickness of the yarn, so in terms of the individual strand itself, how thin or thick it is. And along with needle size, it determines the gauge and the thickness of the material that you knit. So the thicker that the yarn is, the less stitches there will be per centimetre or inch, and the thicker the final material will be. You want to substitute a yarn that is the same weight as the yarn that the pattern was intended for. And it is, in my opinion, the most important thing. If you're just starting out and you want to ignore everything else, just find a yarn that is the same weight as the yarn you're meant to be using. It's actually what I did for years before I learned more about yarn and its properties, and it served me fine most of the time. So then the natural next question is, how do you know if two yarns are of the same weight? And so the answer is that yarns are categorized into different weight categories. So you don't have to run around the yarn shop with a ruler trying to figure out how thick an individual strand is. It will say somewhere on the yarn label what weight the yarn has been categorized into. And we'll go over what those categories are in a sec, but the part that becomes extra confusing is that the names of the categories and the widths of the yarn that fall into those categories differs between countries. And so the world has gotten smaller in the last few decades, which is lovely. It means that we have a lot of access to yarns and patterns from overseas. It does mean, though, that sometimes you have to figure out what the equivalent yarn weight in your weight system is for the yarn that you're trying to figure out the weight of. I'm going to go through what the yarn weight systems are for Australia and New Zealand, and then for the US, and then a little bit about the UK, but I'm not as familiar about the British system. So if I say anything wrong, please correct me because I'd love to learn more about it. Okay, so let's start with Australia and New Zealand. The Aussie/Kiwi system is a system that is numbered ply. And so if you are from overseas and that's already ringing alarm bells, don't worry, we will talk about that at the end. But in Australia and New Zealand, the categories of yarn weight are 2-ply, 4-ply, 5-ply, 8-ply, 10-ply, 12-ply, 14, 16, 18, 20-ply. It's very rare to see anything bigger than a 20-ply yarn. Don't ask me why we use 5-ply instead of 6-ply when everything else is every even number between 2 and 20, but mysteries, who knows. I have seen some 3-ply yarn kicking around there, but it's really not as common. So if you're shopping for yarn in Australia and you want to figure out what the weight is, just look for the word ply and look for the number in front of it, and that's what the yarn weight is. The biggest beginner mistake I've seen with this though is that because they're numbers, people tend to think you can do maths with them, and that's not actually true. The numbers don't actually mean anything. They could just as easily be labeled A, B, C, D, E, F, G. In America, it gets even more confusing because they have 2 weight systems. The first and most common, I think, weight system that they use in the States is a series of random words. I don't know where these words came from. I'm sure they have some historical meaning, and if anyone knows what any of them are, I'd love to hear about it because I am very curious. The different categories have a lot of different names, but the most common ones are lace, fingering, sport, DK, worsted, bulky, super bulky, then jumbo. And so if you ever are looking at an American yarn or an American pattern and you want to figure out what yarn weight it is, then look for one of those 7 words and that will cover most of your bases. So the other weight system that they used was created by the Craft Yarn Council, and they tried to make a standard weight system, which was admirable, except that it didn't quite become standardized. So a lot of the big commercial yarn companies use this system, but it's not as common. The way you know that something has been categorized into a CYC category is that if you look on the label, there's a little picture of a yarn bowl that has a number in the middle, and that is a Craft Yarn Council weight category. And so all of their weight categories have a number and a name. So they are 0/lace, 1/superfine, 2/fine, 3/light, 4/medium, 5/bulky, 6/super bulky, and 7/jumbo. And those categories do have direct equivalences to the other categories that I just named earlier. And don't worry, there's going to be a big table at the end showing all the different systems and how they all line up with each other. One thing I do want to point out with the American terminology, which also trips up beginners, it definitely confused me when I started working with American patterns and yarn, is that you will see a lot of references to sock yarn, and given the way that people use that term, it's very easy to confuse that with the yarn weight categories. But sock yarn is not a weight category. It's a type of yarn that, funnily enough, people use for socks. And it usually means that it's a wool yarn with some nylon mixed in, and it's most commonly a fingering weight yarn. So yeah, just something to watch out for. If anyone says sock yarn, it's usually fingering weight. The UK system seems even more confusing. Like I said, I'm not super familiar with this, but I've seen it in a lot of charts, and so I'll go over briefly. It seems like they use ply for the smaller weights and other random words for the larger weights, but none of the plies are the same as the Australian system, and none of the random words are the same as the American system. So that's lovely. So from what I can tell, it's 1, 2, then 4 ply, and then DK, Aran, chunky, and then super chunky. So there was a lot of random words, numbers, and things. I will give you all of that info in a nice condensed table in a sec. I just want to talk a bit about why any of this matters. So basically, if you're going into Substitute and you want to find a yarn that's the same weight, there's a couple of steps to figuring it out. If you are substituting for a yarn that is from your home country, it's pretty easy. It's already a system you're familiar with, you know how to find a substitute or a yarn that's about the same, so just figure out what it is based on what it says on the label, and then go find a yarn that is about the same weight. If you're trying to substitute for a yarn that is from another country, that isn't labeled in the category system that you're used to, first off, figure out which country the yarn is from, and the easiest way is either to just Google it, or try and look at the description of the yarn or the yarn label and see if you can identify one of the random words or one of the random ply designations written on the yarn ball. And then figure out from there what the equivalent is in your home country, and then go to town and buy whatever it is that you need that fits into that category. And so to condense all of that for you, I know it was a lot of information. As promised, here is a lovely table that has all of the different yarn weight categories from the different countries and what their equivalences are between countries. You can screenshot this if you like, but otherwise I have actually made it as a nice PDF that you can download and print, and that is linked down below in the description box. One thing I do want to point out, especially for my Australian listeners, is that there are more ply categories than every other system. So in the UK and the US, they seem to only have about 7 general categories. But in Australia, we have 10, because it's 2 through 20 ply in every even number except the 5. As the yarns get thicker, in the States and in the UK, I've noticed that the categories cover a larger range of thicknesses. But in Australia, 12 ply and up tend to be still relatively fine-grained. So because of that, in the larger weights, an American category will cover several ply categories in Australia. And what those categories that it covers are can be a little bit contentious. So the bulky and super bulky and jumbo rows in this table, I've put in the ply categories from Australia that from experience seem the most correct to me. But depending on which resources you look at, there will be different equivalences. There's just a little bit of variation. Okay, I'm just going to put it out there. If you're a beginner and your brain's already hurting, just stop here, come back when you've tried it with a couple of different just straight weight substitutions. But before you go, there is one thing I want to point out, which is a very common beginner question that I've seen. So, like I've said, if you're substituting yarn, the easiest thing to do is to just use a yarn from the same weight category. But I see a lot of beginners ask if you can substitute different yarns from different weight categories into the pattern that you're using. So I see people ask, can I use 4 ply yarn for this 8 ply pattern? So the answer is, it depends. It's yes and no. So if the thing that you're making is something that needs to fit on a body, so if it's a piece of clothing, or if it is an accessory that's fitted like a hat or a pair of gloves, then in general, no. You don't want to substitute a different weight of yarn, because the pattern has been written specifically to hit a certain gauge, which is the next topic we're about to cover. And it can be quite difficult to get the same gauge with a different weight of yarn. And if you get the wrong gauge, the item will change size, and so it won't fit you anymore. But if the thing that you're making is something that doesn't need to fit a body, if it's a tea towel or a dishcloth or a blanket or a baby blanket, basically anything that doesn't actually need to fit something, then yes, you can substitute for a different weight, but there are a couple of caveats. The item will be a different size. So in general, if you use a thinner weight yarn than what is recommended in the pattern, then you will have a smaller item. So if the pattern's written for an 8 ply yarn and you try and use a 4 ply yarn for it, it's going to be smaller. And on the other hand, if you use a chunkier yarn, then it will be bigger. And how much smaller or bigger will vary depending on how much thinner or thicker the yarn is that you use. So if you are using an 8 ply yarn for a 10 ply pattern, it's only going to come out a little bit smaller. But if you're using a 4 ply yarn for a 10 ply pattern, then it's going to come out a lot smaller. So just keep that in mind. A lot of the time, if it's only one weight category different, then you can get away with it. So if you do want to substitute a different ply, try and stick to only one category different, and that way it will turn out to be about a similar size. So that brings us to the next way you can measure yarn weight, which is using gauge. In knitting and crochet, gauge is a measure of the number of stitches that fit into either 10 centimeters or 4 inches. So in patterns, it will be quite common to see a statement somewhere that says gauge 22 stitches in 4 inches or 30 stitches in 10 centimeters. And so that just tells you that when you knit a yarn up into a swatch, that's how many stitches should be in that particular length measurement. I don't want to go into a lot of detail about knitting gauge swatches. There are a lot of resources already out there. I'll try and find a couple to link to for you and pop them down in the description box down below. The reason that's important is that it comes back to the sizing that I was talking about. Because at the end of the day, a knitting pattern is a lot of maths. You figure out how many stitches fit into 10 centimeters or 1 centimeter or whatever, and you multiply that number of stitches by however many centimeters you want. Not you as a knitter, I just mean this is something that the designer's done. And so when you are substituting yarn, it's really important to find a yarn that knits up into the same gauge as the gauge intended for the pattern, because that's the way that you make sure that the sizing is the same. So there are a couple of reasons why you would want to go by gauge instead of by yarn weight, and we can go over those now. So for one, it's a more precise measurement. If you took every yarn in the world, it's not like they would neatly fall into exactly 7 different thicknesses or 10 different thicknesses if you're using the Australian system. And so what the yarn categories are is essentially a range of thicknesses that are close enough to each other that you can easily substitute the yarns for each other. But because of that, yarns at the border of those ranges can be surprisingly similar. So I found this particularly true of 4-ply and 5-ply, or fingering and sport, and 8-ply and 10-ply, which is DK and worsted. So if you're using a yarn and it is a thicker 4-ply and you have a 5-ply that is a little bit on the thinner side, then you can actually use those pretty comfortably as substitutes for each other. And the only way you're really going to know that is if you check the gauge. So another reason why you might want to use gauge instead of yarn weight category is that some manufacturers just don't even publish a category on them anymore. So you'll be looking at the ball band and it doesn't say anywhere 4-ply or 10-ply or worsted or bulky or chunky. But what it does often say is the expected gauge and recommended needle size for that yarn. So the gauge for any particular piece of knitting or crochet is determined by a combination of both the yarn weight and the thickness of the needle or hook that you're using. So even if I'm using a DK weight yarn, if I use a 3.5mm needle or a 4mm needle or a 5mm needle, I'm still going to get different gauges. So if you're looking for this information on a yarn label, even if it doesn't have the category, it will say somewhere on the label 22 stitches for 10 centimeters or 15 stitches for 4 inches. And it will also say either a hook size or a needle size, or both, that is recommended for that yarn. And you can use those 2 pieces of information to find other yarns that are a similar weight, because you just find other yarn that matches those 2 pieces of info. If you are looking at a yarn label and you can't find anything that says exactly 15 stitches in 4 inches, what you want to look for is a little picture of a square. It'll say like 15 stitches along the bottom and then like 25 rows along the side, and that is the yarn gauge info. So if you are trying to substitute based on the gauge information that's given on the ball band, it doesn't have to be exactly the same. What I usually do is that I take a look at the stitch count and I try and match that as exactly as possible. And then I look at the needle size, and as long as it's within a size or 2 of the needle size that is recommended in the pattern, then I just go ahead and assume that I can use that yarn. And then the last reason that you might want to use gauge instead of just the straight up yarn categories is when you want to hold yarns together. This is a whole other topic in itself. There's a lot of detail into how you substitute the different weights with different doubled up strands. But as a general rule, if you use 2 strands of the same weight of yarn, you're going to get the equivalent of 2 weights bigger. So if I hold 2 5-ply strands together, I'm going to essentially get a 10-ply strand. And if I hold 2 8-ply strands together, I'm going to get a 12-ply strand. So this is what I was talking about the Australian system not really working with the maths, because if you hold 2 strands of 8-ply together, you don't get a 16. You get somewhere in the range of a 12 or a 14. If you have a 12-ply pattern and you want to use an 8-ply yarn, the only way that you're going to know if you really can substitute that is by doubling up the 8-ply, knitting yourself a gauge swatch, and seeing if the gauge matches the gauge for the pattern that's given in the 12-ply yarn. Alright, one last thing I want to note is about ply. For my Aussie friends, because we call our yarn weights ply, we actually don't talk about the real meaning of ply. And so what ply actually means is the number of strands that are twisted together to make your strand of yarn. This is a ball of 10-ply that I have from Bendigo Wool & Mills, and in the States this would be called worsted. And if you look at it closely, you can see that it's made up of individual strands, and if you untwist it a little bit, you can actually count how many strands there are. So if you untwist it, and then there we go, that's like an individual strand, and from what I can tell there are 4 of them in this yarn. So in the States this would be called a 4-ply worsted weight yarn. And when I first moved to America, I got really confused because I did see something that was called a 4-ply worsted weight yarn, and I was like, how can something be 4-ply and 10-ply at the same time? Because I knew at that point the worsted weight meant 10-ply. So I feel like because we call our weights ply, it's just a whole piece of information that we never learn about yarn. And so just to give you a quick crash course, the biggest difference between plies is whether you have a single ply yarn or a multi-plied yarn. So single plied yarns, one of which I have right here, tend to be a lot fluffier. They're fluffy and airy, and once you knit them, when you wash them, they will expand a bit more. The term in knitting is bloom. So they'll expand a little bit more and get a little bit thicker. For yarns that are plied, so essentially 2-ply and up, they are a little bit sturdier. They don't do that blooming thing, so they won't expand. They generally stay the same thickness even after you wash them. They also have better stitch definition, and they are a little bit more hard wearing. So they don't wear out as easily. Single plied yarn tends to wear out a little bit more quickly, so I wouldn't use this for socks. Single plied material can look really lovely. It's just so fuzzy and ethereal looking. Sorry, neither is better or worse. It's just another property that you have to watch out for, and using different number of plies can just give you different looks. Okay, so I feel like that was a lot of information, so I'm going to stop bombarding you with info right now. And so like I said, in general you can just substitute the same weight of yarn for a different yarn, and most of the time it will do you fine. But the rest of the time you end up with a bit of a mess. And the reasoning for that is a whole other range of topics around what the yarn is made out of, what the ply is like, how tightly it's twisted, all sorts of things, which we will cover in a later set of videos. But if this was helpful, let me know down in the comments. I'd really love to know. And if you have any questions about yarn weight or ply that I didn't cover, just shoot me a comment and I will either reply to you or I'll cover those questions in the next video about yarn substitution. Also, I have 2 requests from you guys. If I said anything wrong about the British system, please let me know because I'd love to learn more. And also, I don't know if any of you are in Canada, but I never see mention of a Canadian system in any of the resources or blog posts or anything that I've seen about yarn weights. So I always just assumed that you'll use the American system, but I'd love to know what you do in Canada because I'm actually quite curious. Okay, so that's it. If you did like this video, aside from leaving a comment, please do me a favor and like and subscribe. Liking the video actually helps other people find it, which is great, and it's a good way of sharing the information around. And if you subscribe and hit the little bell notification thingy-majiggy, it'll update you when I post the second 2 videos in this series. So you can keep up to date and learn more about all of the other things that I mentioned that I will cover later. But other than that, I am Katrina Walser from All Fun Cat. If you are looking for me anywhere else on the internet, I've dropped a bunch of links down below to where you can find me on Instagram and my newsletter and things like that. And other than that, I post new videos every Thursday. So I will see you next Thursday, and until then, happy knitting.